Doom. What could I possibly say about it that hasn't been said by countless others? Oh wait, I just remembered something I've been wanting to say for many years now. Y'all need to stop talking shit about Doom 3. For years, people have treated Doom 3 like the oddball middle child between the original series and the rebooted series in 2016. Sure, we can all admit that it didn't have the kind of impact you'd expect from a sequel to one of the greatest first-person shooters of all time, but it's not because it was a bad game. First-person shooters were in flux at the time. The genre was changing. While all the focus on graphics might have been to the detriment of some other features, what you're left with is a very solid game that delivers a unique experience. An experience really is the operative word here. I played through the game too many times to count, and it's one of the few games where I always feel engaged the whole time. Now I have to be honest, before Doom 3 was released and I was reading about the development, I too felt heartbroken. It seemed like id was looking to push the limits of graphics and totally discard the fundamentals of Doom. That is to say, mowing down hordes of demons. Although to be fair, some of that sentiment was motivated by bitterness at the realization that I'd probably never own a PC powerful enough to actually run the game. Sour grapes, if you will. Lucky for me, there was a rather well-made port for the original Xbox, and playing that totally subverted all my expectations. I was converted. I saw the light of Doom 3. I think the best way to defend Doom 3 is to address two of the most common arguments against it. Now, I'm not categorically dismissing these arguments, but I will do my best to refute them. Also, I will read them in a mocking, dumb-sounding voice. You've been warned. It's so dark. Yeah, that's called atmosphere. And while the original flashlight mechanic was annoying and had to be fixed in several different ways, I rarely felt forced to use it too frequently, or for extended periods of time. Most of the time I could see well enough to fight, and that's what matters. I don't remember ever dying because I got attacked while using the flashlight. Lots of wildly successful first-person games have come out since then that are dark. Many of them straight up tell you in the beginning to adjust the brightness of your screen down to a considerable degree. You don't get to fight hordes of enemies like in the original games. Okay, this one I can sympathize with, but let's unpack this a little bit. First of all, the original Doom pitted you against hordes of enemies because it had limited mechanics at the time. When you research the origins of Doom, and look at the later development of projects like Quake, you see a pattern emerge. The devs seem to have wanted to put a lot more into the game, but weren't able to due to either time or technical constraints. Wolfenstein 3D was basically just a maze with enemies, whereas Doom just opened that world up more. Even before fully 3D games, you could see that the more interactive and complex games got, the fewer enemies you'd face at one time. Of the top 3 build engine games of Duke Nukem 3D, Blood, and Shadow Warrior, Blood is probably the only one that in my opinion has you facing anything close to a horde of enemies at any given time. Quake 2 doesn't have hordes of enemies, and most Half-Life encounters entail a small group or squad of enemies at a time. The only well-known, fully 3D game of the early 2000s that has you fighting hordes of enemies that I can think of is Serious Sam, and that was deliberately designed around that feature. Was that so great? It certainly has that classic Doom feel at times, but personally, I will always associate every Serious Sam game I've ever played with circle strafing backwards while holding the fire button. It gets old. And this is a little nitpicky, but I always felt the charm of the classic Doom's massive battles wasn't just that you were fighting lots of enemies, but that the bodies also remained behind, essentially a carpet of carnage you leave in your wake. What was the name of the first episode of Doom? Knee deep in the dead. Not even the new Doom games give you that. Also, if you're going to get upset about how Doom 3 differed from the classic games, you can't deny that Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal also varied greatly from the original. Yes, you're facing more enemies, but let's remember that Doom wasn't originally about ripping and tearing. You shot things until they were dead. The newer Doom games revolutionized the FPS with concepts like the combat loop, but how is that not different from the classic Doom? I'd agree the combat style of the new Doom games is objectively superior to that of Doom 3, but let's stop pretending that's because it's some kind of return to the original game's roots. For the record, yes, you do face fewer enemies in Doom 3. You're rarely up against more than 3 enemies at a time, and sometimes the game pits you against nuisance enemies like the Trites, spidery little horrors clearly inspired by John Carpenter's The Thing. However, Doom 3 compensates for this by making the enemies tougher. So instead of cutting down a mob of weak enemies, you're dodging and weaving as you unload on several enemies that can take a few shells. That, and you have to reload, of course. And what I like about this is that it gave the game a certain distinct rhythm and feel. One other YouTuber compared it it to a dance, and that's a spot-on analogy. See, as usual, your shotgun is your workhorse in this game, but it has a bit of a wide spread, and standard enemies like imps can take a few shots at a moderate distance. However, you can one-shot them if you sprint right up to them and basically stick the barrel of your shotgun down their throat. Occasionally, that's not going to do it, so you have to get good at sprinting into point-blank range, blasting them right in the face, and then quickly backing off before they have a chance to melee you with their claws. Getting up close triggers the melee attack, so if you didn't kill them on the first shot, they're totally open to another shotgun blast at close range while they uselessly flail their arms at you. Since the imps start out throwing fireballs, you're also not always going to be able to just run straight up to them. Now when you're taking on a room full of several imps, this kind of combat gets more complex. Like I said, you're always engaged here. I will say that this system of combat is a little bit weakened by the fact that most versions of the game seem to dump way too much ammo on your player, regardless of the difficulty level. As I mentioned before, I first played Doom 3 on the Xbox, and maybe I'm misremembering something about it after all these years, but what really sticks in my head when it comes to my first experience with Doom 3 was that ammo was fairly scarce. This meant that finding the codes to unlock the storage lockers and cabinets you encounter throughout the game was crucial. The ultimate effect was that, to me at least, Doom 3 had an element of survival horror in it. Years later, I'd play the original PC version, and I didn't remember having to scrounge for ammo all the time. Lately, for convenience sake, I've been playing the BFG edition, which is designed to run well on modern systems, and apart from a lot of other unpopular changes from the original, you always seem to be totally flush with ammo in this game. Just look at how many shells I have in these clips from relatively early in the game. Over 300. The original game capped that off at 100 max after you got the backpack power-up. And because I have so many shells, I'm also running around with a full load of machine gun ammo. Later in the game, plasma cells are crucial, but you always seem to have enough, at least in the BFG edition. I guess you could mitigate this a bit by not bothering with the supply cabinets, and maybe not poking around for every hidden ammo cache. So having totally refuted the main arguments that Doom 3 has faced in the 16 years since its release, what is the case for Doom 3? Does it really deserve to be seen as the black sheep of the series now that we're at Doom Eternal? Well, I like to look at Doom 3 by considering the roots of Doom. If you study the game's origins, you know it was heavily inspired by James Cameron's classic Aliens. Now, do you remember how the Marines did against the Xenomorph in that film?
Talk to me.
Copy, copy.
Huh?
We are leaving.
Hey, maybe you haven't been keeping up on current events, but we just got our asses kicked, pal.
Thank you, Private Hudson. Exactly. Aliens is a film about overconfident badasses running into something tougher than they can handle. Now, getting back to Doom, it's true that John Carmack wasn't interested in giving the game a deep story, and like I said at the time, the technology limited the game's storytelling abilities. But the idea of a secret military base being overrun by literal demons from hell is a really great premise. Doom 3 builds on that premise and poses the question, what would it be like if you were in this demonic invasion scenario? That's what the realism is about, making you feel like your real-world, vulnerable self in this dark, chaotic situation where one wrong move spells death. Doom 3 is more than just shooting on the move. A large part of combat is preemptive, evaluating the battle space before you enter, and carefully keeping your flanks and back secure so as not to get surrounded. And Doom 3 anticipates this because sometimes that secure wall you've got at your back slides up to reveal an enemy waiting to attack you. The game tops all of this off with atmosphere from start to finish. You've got a human villain this time who's seduced by the power of hell. Dr. Betruger is in many ways reminiscent of Sam Neill's character in the 90s sci-fi horror thriller Event Horizon, which I personally saw as a sort of unofficial Doom movie. And if you disagree with that, I recommend you just go and watch one of the official Doom movies and get back to me. Doom 3 is very much like Event Horizon in the sense that apart from just contending with demons, you're also faced with the haunted environment. You experience visual and auditory hallucinations, distortions, and poltergeist-like activity. One way the game always keeps you on edge is through sound. Everywhere you go, you're usually hearing a cacophony of various sounds you'd expect to hear from the machinery in a futuristic Mars base. But every once in a while, that venting steam or metal on metal is actually an imp about to attack you, and you have to be ready for that.
What was that? Kill it!
Yes, a lot of the horror material could fall under the category of jump scares. But what can I say? For me, it just works. I act cautiously as I carefully pick my way through the base, my back to a hopefully solid wall, ready to fight or flee as necessary. Okay, I do have to admit, this right here gets pretty annoying. Doom 3 also had a good take on the immersive storytelling technique. Unlike Half-Life, you can get started on killing demons fairly quickly, and much of the story plays out in emails and audio logs you're typically not required to actually read. I do, of course, because I'm a lore whore, but you could skip all that if you want. Personally, I think the voice actors did good work with the audio logs. One email exchange you find actually goes to the trouble of explaining just how a shipment of chainsaws ended up on Mars. All in all, the audio logs and email exchanges paint a picture of a rapidly deteriorating situation in which employees become increasingly baffled, scared, and paranoid as their reality is slowly eroded by the demonic forces seeping into the complex. In fact, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that we don't really need a good Doom movie because Doom 3 is that movie. And best of all, you're the star. Although Doom 3 was a self-contained story with a cliffhanger ending, the expansion pack, Resurrection of Evil, wraps up the story of the mad scientist Dr. Betruger and introduces some completely new game mechanics as well. Doom 3 may not have had the impact of the original or the 2016 reboot, but it is a really good game that has brought me back for repeated playthroughs ever since I first tried it in 2005. I'd say it was very much a product of its time. That is to say, it was in development during a time of more plot-driven, more linear, late 90s FPS games like Quake 2 and Half-Life. And the fact that Doom has returned to prominence while Half-Life stumbled and fell suggests that perhaps that approach was misguided, but hindsight is 20/20. Doom 3 might be the odd one out in the series, but it let us experience the story of Doom in a more visceral, realistic way, recreating the paranoia and claustrophobia in a way the original engine could never have done. So if you really want the complete Doom experience and you haven't played it yet, I highly recommend getting a copy of Doom 3 and the expansion pack Resurrection of Evil. For all its faults, the BFG edition is readily available and comes with both of those, plus a new episode and several of the original Doom games all rolled into one. And if you really want a thrill, play it in the dark with a good set of headphones. In other words, not like me, because I play that shit with the lights on. Alright everyone, that is the review. Glad we all agreed that Doom 3 is in fact a great game. If you look in the description for the video below, you can find a link to my Patreon page where you can support me. But I realize times are tight right now, so you know what's free? Clicking like and subscribe on the channel. I'd like to thank my existing patrons for their support, and I'd like to thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.